found a really cool way to display my PowerPoint without having split screens and all that kind of stuff. So if I'm honest, you all will be my first guinea pigs with this. So if you have any feedback on that, I would appreciate that. But so it'll just be my screen. So if you kind of enlarge my screen, you'll be able to see the PowerPoint, and then me, and hopefully my face doesn't like freeze in some weird position or with some kind of weird expression on my face. Because I know it's different time of the day everywhere. If you want to turn your video on, fantastic. If you are not in a place where you'd like people to see you right now, that's perfectly fine. I do have to record these sessions for CQI's purposes. I know I mentioned in the email, unfortunately, I can't share any of those recordings with you, but I do have to record those for CQI's purposes. Just kind of verifies that I actually delivered the course and that you attended. So feel free to kind of, whether you want to turn on your video or not, or mute yourself or whatnot, no big deal at all. I am going to give just a few more moments, and then we're going to jump into things. All right, I think we are going to go ahead and get started. Yeah, there we go. I was waiting for Tristan to jump on. I figured you were the most challenging time zone wise, so appreciate you starting your early day with us. All right, well, I am going to we're going to go ahead and get started here. I noticed that there's one person whose audio is still connecting, and I'm not sure if you're able to hear us, but you might want to log out and try to come back in. Yeah. So I want to welcome you to the CQI Coffee Fermentations course. My name is Tim Hines, and I'll be leading us through our time together. As I shared with you previously, or I was just sharing very briefly, hopefully you can see my screen and see the PowerPoint presentation now. Yeah, this is kind of hopefully I'm new to this kind of using a software that's like for gamers, which I am not, but it's an interesting way. Okay, cool. The volume is slightly lower. Okay, cool. I can fix that. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate. I can make some adjustments here on that. Let's see here. All right. Let me adjust that really quick. And then hopefully that's gotten a little bit louder for you. And if there's any other issues. So as like I said, this probably isn't your very first Zoom meeting, especially over the last several months as things have been. But just to highlight a few things, if you have any questions, any comments, anything at all, you're more than welcome to throw those over in the chat. I've got that over here. I can track, and you can either send me something directly, or you can send it to everybody in the group. Oh, no worries, Tristan. No worries at all about being late. And I will have those. I'll be able to track. I also want to apologize in advance. I am working from home, and I do have small children in my house. So if you do hear any screaming of any sort, I promise nobody is being harmed or injured. It's just small children. So apologize in advance for that. So I would like to kick off our time together a little bit with some brief introductions. I currently serve as the Coffee Education Manager with Sukafina, and I am the director for the center. The center is our online learning community that is focused on providing various types of educational programs and educational courses to the global coffee industry. Sukafina is a global coffee trading company. We have operations all over the world, and I get to spend my time really playing in the education space. And so I'm excited for it's a newer job for me, and I'm excited. I've been with the company for about 2 years, and I'm excited for that for many of the different things that we are building. I do work with CQI as a Q processing instructor. I teach various types of classes that CQI has, as well as the Q processing level 1 and level 2 courses. And I also teach for the sensory program and teach the Q grader course as well. I am based in the U.S. I'm currently calling in today from Houston, Texas, in the southern U.S. I started in coffee during my time living in southern China. Was there from 2009 until 2019, working in the coffee industry, and started off more in development work. Was focusing on projects focused in water education and English. I started off as an English teacher and taught English for about 5 minutes and realized it was not what I wanted to do long term. I kind of had this illusion that if I was, just because I was a native English speaker, that I would be a good English teacher, and that was unfortunately not the case. But I began working with coffee farming communities all the way down on the southwest corner of Yunnan province in China, along the Myanmar and China border, and began working with coffee farming communities. And so really my start in coffee was really focused on the intersection of development and coffee. And so I've always kind of had that in the back of my mind. I've spent a lot of time working on the producing side of the industry, so both the cultivation and processing and trade of coffee. I tell people I can turn coffee brown. I don't call myself a roaster, and every now and then I can draw something pretty in the top of a espresso cup or a latte, but I definitely don't call myself a barista. So my focus has been more on the kind of upstream, on the producer side. Just to share with you a little bit briefly about this class, and something to just clarify and articulate. CQI for a long time has had essentially these courses, certification courses. So things like the Q grader program, the Q processing level 1, level 2, level 3, Q Arabica, Q Robusta, and even now offering a Q cupping essentials course. So all of these have been certificate type of courses, where you take the course, you take a test, and then if you pass the test and the other types of requirements, then you receive the certificate. Over the last year, CQI has been working to release a series of what we call classes, and those are a little bit different than courses. And the main difference is that the classes are very specific to one certain type of topic or one module, and there's not really any type of testing or anything for certification purposes. It's more about basically sharing information, developing different types of competencies that would go hand in hand with some of the courses that are being offered. So for example, this coffee fermentations is one of those classes, and there'll be other ones that we will be releasing, that CQI rather will be releasing over the course of the next year, that are focused on building competencies in, say, sensory or processing, other types of aspects that can be used to support you as you're pursuing your kind of longer term goals of professional development and any types of certification. So that's why this class, there's no requirements in terms of a test or anything like that for kind of passing. You will get the certificate of completion from the CQI, and I'll mention here in a second, just again, to make sure that everybody has registered at the CQI website. But ultimately, these classes are all about developing and building certain competencies and reinforcing different knowledge. And so the format is that it's going to be more lecture-based. I'm going to try to make them as engaging, as fun as we can, and I want you to ask whatever questions you have. I don't know, I can't say that I'll be able to answer all those questions, but I definitely am would welcome you. And again, whether or not you might feel nervous to ask something verbally, whether English isn't your first language, or it's 2 a.m. in the morning there and you're just not really feeling like jumping on a sharing or speaking out loud, no problem at all. Feel free to throw any questions you have in the chat. I'll be monitoring that, and whenever I get to a point where we can throw those in there, we definitely will do that. Before I jump into this and to talking a little bit about this class, I did want to throw a brief poll out there, if you wouldn't mind. There should be, let's see, it might have thrown both the questions out there at once. If it did, I apologize. Didn't mean for it to do that. But if you wouldn't mind, the first question is just, where are you joining today's class from? And then what part of the coffee supply chain you're involved in. And I know that sometimes people are involved with so many different things, so feel free to click several different ones if that represents kind of your role in the industry. While I love doing face-to-face classes and in-person classes, one thing I really enjoyed about this kind of virtual learning type of opportunity is that it does tend to bring together a very diverse group of people from different parts of the world, at different parts of the industry, different segments, and with different experiences. So yeah, excited. So we see here we've got some South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, Middle East, Australia, all over the place. Producers, processor, exporter, importer, roaster, cafe owner, enthusiast, and other. Awesome. Fantastic. Give you a few more seconds to kind of share your answer if you get a chance. Awesome. All right. Very cool. All right. Well, great. Well, I'm excited. And, oh, sorry, Anna, you're having some issues. I apologize about that. So as we talk about this specific class, this class, Coffee Fermentation, was actually a class that was developed and brought together between a partnership with CQI and Lallemand. And really the idea was to provide a foundation and information about this kind of ever-growing, ever-expanding topic, which is fermentation, both in how it's utilized in a post-harvest process, but then also how we can use it as a tool to develop a portfolio of flavor profiles. And I'm going to use that term quite regularly in terms of a portfolio of flavor profiles, and we'll definitely share more and define that a little bit more here within over our next couple of days. You will unfortunately probably get very tired of hearing my voice over the next 5 days, but hopefully there's some good information and some good opportunities for learning and for growth. To share with you very briefly about who CQI is, the mission of CQI is to improve the quality of coffee in the lives of people who produce it. There's several different areas and several different focuses for that, promoting a common language of quality, providing technical services and other types of values. And again, we have our certificate courses, but really this course here, being a class, is really about providing that foundation and that base of knowledge and information. And I will just share, there's so much about fermentation that, quite frankly, we just don't know. There hasn't been the research, there hasn't been the extensive amount of work into investigating these things. And so what I want to try to do over the next couple of days is provide some foundational concepts and foundational understandings, share with you what we do know and what we have seen in coffee through research and other types of investigation, and then share and try to connect some of those dots together. And so you'll notice here in a minute, when I share kind of the outline of what we'll be progressing through over the next several days, a lot of it does come down to the sharing of basic information and foundational concepts, and then we kind of slowly build on that. And so I want to encourage you to please ask your questions. Some of the questions I might hold off on answering until we get to that portion of our discussion, but I in no way do I want to discourage you from asking and for presenting those presenting those questions. So again, I do just want to remind you about ensuring that you have registered for this course at the CQI website. At the conclusion of our course and conclusion of our time together, you will that's where you'll get your certificate and other types of information. But it's always good to keep that updated, and even sometimes I'll say it as an instructor, maybe throwing a picture on there or something is always a great little touch, just so that we have a way of connecting. I know that for this course, you also registered for an account at the center. I want to thank you for that. We will not be spamming you and other things. We do have a newsletter if you're interested in getting that, and there's other resources there for you as well. We have a podcast where I share a little bit more about the different facets, different aspects of the coffee industry, and then also have another. There's some other kind of free resources out there, green coffee poster, some other courses. You can check it all out. If you have any questions, let me know. Mario, yes. So once you enroll at the CQI site, that's fantastic and good. You do need to also register at the center, and I'll drop that web address in for you. Here we go. .coffee. All right. And you can go to that website and go to the course and just make sure that you're registered there as well. If there's any issues, I'll get in contact with you after our class. No worries. And then, who is Lallemand? Lallemand, if you haven't heard maybe the name Lallemand, you might be familiar with the term Lal Cafe, which is people are kind of referring to as the yeast company. I'm sure that they prefer to go by a little bit more, specific and term than that. But basically, Lallemand is a global leader in production of yeast and bacteria. Now, this is something that's used in many different industries. But around 2014, Lallemand has been producing products that they've branded as Lal Cafe as specific microorganisms to be used in coffee processing. You might have heard things like Intenso, and there are other products that they have out there. And so it's when we'll talk more in a later presentation about inoculation and how these things are being used. But really, Lallemand as an organization, as a company, has been heavily involved with fermentation and the use of different microorganisms in fermentation across many different industries. And so it's been great to have their expertise and their support in developing some of these materials. I want to again remind you about please ask questions. The pace or the amount of the speed at which we work through these different materials and different presentations, definitely there is some flexibility to that. And we've got 25 people on this Zoom call, and so happy to facilitate and something I just want to encourage you with, and something that I've always tried to remember as I've gone through and progressed through different types of education is that it's important that we acknowledge what we don't know and not be ashamed of that. There's sometimes when I remember, and I always tell people this story about how my fifth grade teacher, Mrs. Wallace, always or had a conference with my mom after the first 6 weeks of class, and basically told my mom that she had a problem with me, and that problem was that I asked too many questions. Now, I'm not too sure why that's a problem, but I've always kind of had that attitude about life, and so would encourage you to ask as many questions as you'd like to. And as I said, I won't necessarily have all the answers, but we can. I do know people who are much smarter than me that I can ask, and we'll talk together about those. But it's good to remember that and to have that as well. A couple final little housekeeping notes. I am recording this session for the purposes of submitting to the CQI verification that we've gone through. Sorry about that, Brian. Yeah, no worries. Is everybody else okay with the audio, or are we having some issues? Um, can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Yes. Okay, cool. Getting a couple yeses. Okay, great. Fantastic. Awesome. Sorry about that. Hopefully, cool. So I do want to just state that I am recording for CQI's purposes. Unfortunately, I can't send that recording to you. I'm also very sorry, and I just want to again apologize for this. There's not really much I can do, but there's no workbook or course materials that I have to send you. But what I can do is, if at any point there's information that I'm going through on the PowerPoint and you say, oh, I didn't get that down, or can I get the reference that you had, or what was the source of that you had? Drop me an email, send me a note, send it in the chat. I would be happy to, after or in between classes, send that information to you or make sure that you have that. It's just not, unfortunately, and I've already submitted my frustration with that, so I do apologize. But I'd be happy to go back and go over anything that you need. All right. So I'm going to throw this question out there. I'd love for you to either send an answer, response through in the chat, or if you want to jump on audio and share your thoughts. But really, the question is, what is fermentation, and why is it important in post-harvest processing? So what is fermentation is one part of that, and why is it important in post-harvest processing? So I'll throw that out to you. I'll shut up for a few minutes so that we can get some feedback, and I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Fermentation is important for removing the mucilage from the coffee.
Yeah, great. I forgot to unmute myself. Yeah, so great. So it's an important step of removing that mucilage. Awesome. Great job. What are some other thoughts? What is fermentation, and why is it important in post-harvest processing? Nico over here says bacteria eating sugar. Okay, great. So you're kind of identifying some sense of microorganism activity, consuming or eating some kind of substrate or product. Great, fantastic. What else?
It involves for the taste of the cup.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some we might not know exactly kind of how to draw those specific connections, but we know that there's some impact to sensory, whether that's in the taste, whether that's aromas, body, whatever that is. There's some impact that we have to taste. Here we go. Anna says we can use fermentation developing flavor. Right on. It's a process. All right, here Raja says it's a process to remove outer layers of coffee while developing the flavors of coffee. Okay, cool. It's a process which gives different flavor. Ibrahim, degradation of sugars and releasing of acids or alcoholic plus CO2, make bright acidity, maintain the sweetness. It's for developing flavors. Awesome. So, and I thank you everybody for sharing your thoughts, and feel free if you are still working on a response to throw that in there. Diego, breaking down sugars, it will influence the sensory flavors of coffee. Absolutely. So all of those are different things of how we can say what is fermentation. And basically the point, one of the significant takeaways that I hope you have from this course is, at a foundational level, a better understanding of what is fermentation. Because in many of the things that you all shared are absolutely correct in terms of the impact or the byproduct of fermentation. Bacteria eating sugars, or being able to wash the mucilage free, all of those are going to be part of that. But at a foundational concept, what is happening? And how do we even define what fermentation is? And that's kind of where we're going to start our discussion today. But remember kind of those responses and those things that you thought about as we progress through the next couple of days. So our basic format, today we're going to talk about what is fermentation. There's a little bit of kind of introductory stuff, but then we're going to talk about what is fermentation. Tomorrow we're going to jump into microorganisms and the fermentation process. And then we'll kind of move throughout the next several different units, I don't want to tell you what we're going to cover because we might cover one presentation, we might jump into two. It just kind of depends on how things go. But over the course of the next 5 days, we'll work through these different units and have some discussions around those. My goal would be that after we take by going through this class, that you're able to understand different ways to define fermentation and how we articulate that. And again, there's a lot of terminology that we're going to use, some specific terminology. And if you have any uncertainty to what these terms mean, I understand not everybody has English as their first language, and you're working across multiple languages, which I'm very jealous of the amount of languages and cultures and such represented here. But that will be one of the things that we want to walk away with. We'll talk about bacteria, yeast, and filamentous fungi. So I don't know if you're a fungi or a fungi, but depending on, I guess, your level of or how you decide, I'm going to be a fungi for this class. So if you're a fungi or if you're a fungi, no problem at all. We accept all kinds of people in this class. We're going to talk about fermentation as its purpose and use of preserving foods and creating flavors. We will talk about fermentation as a unit operation in coffee processing, how it can lead to the development of flavors, and even have some discussion on starter cultures and how they are used in fermentation. And then we'll finish things up by talking about how we can use fermentation to create a portfolio of flavor profiles. So we are going to dive into our first discussion, which is what is fermentation. And really what we are looking at here is being able to provide a little bit of a definition on what fermentation technically is. Now, the one thing I do want to clarify is that depending on who you ask, depending on what type of industry person, or what sector you ask, fermentation can be defined in several different ways. You have some people that will begin to articulate fermentation as, in a very strict sense, as a type of anaerobic respiration that allows for continued glycolysis. Now you're like, okay, well, what the heck? What does all that mean? We'll get into it. We'll dive down into it. But you also have a very less strict or more broad sense of what fermentation is, which is essentially microorganisms getting energy and producing byproducts. I always, and we're going to what we call anthropomorphize, which is basically where we talk about coffee as if it's a human. We'll use that terminology a lot, and we'll, eating and maybe some people will say defecating things out in the sense of being more anthropomorphic. Obviously, we understand that we're talking about microorganisms and their pathways and so forth are very different. But if you'll allow me, we'll kind of use some of that terminology just so that we can understand it a little easier. So in this lesson, in this first lesson that we look at, we're going to define fermentation in a very strict biological way and see how it's used in food fermentations. We're going to talk about two different pathways, both catabolic and anabolic, and we'll give some examples of those. And then we're going to begin to talk about different life forms. And we're going to have a very brief discussion on taxonomy, only because we're going to throw out some terms and throw out some things that I think it's important for us to understand as we dive down into some of those discussions. Because I know how there's times when a terminology is used or a term is defined, and if you don't understand what the words mean, it can be difficult to fully comprehend what that concept is all about. And so we'll look at that and we'll talk more about that. So we're going to begin again by talking about what is fermentation. And what I'd like to do is start off by looking at a little bit of just kind of some dictionaries and textbooks. Let's see what is out there in terms of basic definitions that we can go off about what fermentation is. All right. So if we look at old Merriam-Webster, the dictionary, we look at kind of how they define what fermentation is. Specifically, if you look, it talks about how fermentation is the enzyme catalyzed anaerobic breakdown of an energy-rich compound, such as a carbohydrate, by the action of microorganisms that occurs naturally and is commonly used in the production of various products, such as food, alcoholic beverages, pharmaceuticals, especially by controlling microbial enzymatic activity. Okay, so again, a couple of the key kind of highlights here. Merriam-Webster is defining this as an anaerobic breakdown. So think breaking apart, breaking down of an energy-rich compound. Okay, so some type of compound that has energy in it by the action of microorganisms. So we're clearly talking about some type of actors, some types of actions that they're taking that occurs naturally and is commonly used in the production of various products, especially by controlling microbial enzymatic activity. And again, we're going to dive down deeper into these. Let's just kind of continue on and see what we see. In the Oxford Dictionary, we see that they define fermentation as the chemical breakdown of a substance by bacteria, yeast, or other microorganisms, typically involving effervescence, which is basically just bubbling, or carbon dioxide, essentially is what they're pointing to, and the giving off of heat. Okay, so there's some temperature that is released. Now, it's interesting how even within these two sources, you begin to see some differences in how they actually define and break down fermentation. On the one hand, you have Merriam-Webster, we're talking about this anaerobic breakdown. So what does that really mean, or what does that correlate to? These energy-rich compounds, what are those and how are those used? We do see that they're both really pointing to microorganisms. And tomorrow we're going to start our time really diving into those microorganisms and talking more about their properties and their characteristics. And we see some semblance of, in both of these instances, pointing to different types of byproducts. So we see effervescence as kind of CO2 production. We see giving off of heat. We also do see here with kind of in the production of various food products. And so we see there's some influence here to different byproducts. But what do the textbooks say? All right. So if we look at fermentation defined in different textbooks, if we look specifically in botany, basically this textbook here by Mosseth, it defines fermentation as a synonym for anaerobic respiration. Okay, previously we had Merriam-Webster talking about this anaerobic breakdown. Now we're throwing in this term of respiration. Okay, so we're starting to kind of see some of the complexities unravel as we try to define what fermentation is. So in this instance with respiration, and we're going to talk about this more here shortly, but we're essentially talking about how energy is created. And we'll talk a lot in this course about ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and I've got that written out and defined here shortly for you. But essentially, that is the energy that sustains life. And so many of these processes and so many of these steps are all about how cells or how microorganisms develop and establish these, or the pathways rather, to create this ATP, this energy source. And this, and particularly when we talk about botany, they're understanding fermentation as to be a synonym for a type of anaerobic respiration. All right, then if you look at medical microbiology, you see that in fermentation, another type of heterotrophic metabolism, which just to kind of note, a heterotrophic is basically an organism that cannot produce its own food. Okay, so it takes nutrition from other sources, particularly organic carbons, and it utilizes those in its own production of energy. Okay, so it's a heterotroph is an organism that cannot produce its own food. But in fermentation, another type of heterotrophic metabolism, an organic compound, rather than oxygen, is the terminal electron or hydrogen acceptor. Again, a lot of kind of crazy, maybe some terminology we're not extremely familiar with, but what it's pointing to is the byproducts that are being created and how and what byproducts are being utilized in that specific metabolic pathway. Okay, so we can clearly see that even between the two dictionary terminology, the two dictionary descriptions, these textbook definitions that, based off the type of industry that you're in or how you're approaching fermentation, there could be slight differences in how we understand and how we define what fermentation actually is. So let's look at the coffee industry. Let's look at a few different examples of what the coffee industry has to say about fermentation. William Uckers is a kind of an older textbook that a lot of times is used in references. It goes back to 1922. It's really interesting. If you ever get a chance to dive into, I always enjoy looking at old textbooks or old information, because there's really interesting to find out what was being done and how things were being understood. But Uckers essentially defines fermentation as the loosening of the skin so that it may be removed easily, after which the coffee is properly dried and aged. Interesting to just intentional aging, but we won't go there because that's not the content of this class. But Uckers goes on to say, interesting, this is going back to 1922, there is first a yeast fermentation producing alcohol, and then a bacterial action giving mainly inactive lactic acid, which is the main factor in loosening the parchment. So there's some kind of terminology, some things I think a little bit different of what we would see as contemporary science having shown, or contemporary research rather, having shown. But it's interesting to note that Uckers is pointing to a couple different things. One, he's talking about loosening of skin. Maybe we would include mucilage, which I believe, Brian, what you mentioned in your kind of definition of fermentation, as well as several others over in the chat. But then you see this kind of identification of progression that happens. Uckers is clearly pointing to different microbes that are active. I will note, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow, we oftentimes talk about yeast and bacteria as if it's like a singular type of thing, when the reality is there's thousands of species that make up that category. So just, something to note. But Uckers is pointing to kind of this succession of microorganism activity that's happening, which we'll talk more about, and actually is what we see. Of course, there's different complexities to that, but it was interesting back in 1922 to see that we're already kind of identifying and understanding that. If we go to another source, look at Vincent back in 1987, identifies that the object of fermentation is to hydrolyze the mucilage in order to facilitate its final removal. So we see some of this being pointed to more about what the objective of fermentation is. So not necessarily defining it as its metabolic pathway or its actual activity, or rather its actual functioning of what it's doing inside the cell, but more so about how we used it to achieve certain ends or certain goals. Okay, so kind of put that in the back of your mind as well. In 2013, the Colombian Coffee Growers Manual articulated that natural fermentation is the simplest and most traditional way to degrade mucilage, since it interrelates the agent supplied naturally by the environment. So, I never want to be, I'm not the police on terminology, okay? I do think that words matter, and we have to be really careful what words we're using. When I first read that, I was thinking natural fermentation. Is that like natural processed, or is that like a submerged fermentation, or is that like what, as opposed to what? And this is speaking more towards like a natural fermentation versus an inoculated type of fermentation. Okay, that's what they're describing here, or what their point of reference is for this discussion. But we see that natural fermentation is the simplest and most traditional way to degrade mucilage, according to this Columbia Coffee Growers Manual. And again, they're really pointing to the outcome of hydrolyzing, of being able to wash free that mucilage. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely, Santiago. And what I think is really interesting, thanks for your note about that, is, when we begin to discuss about these terms, there is the actual term that's used, and then there's translating that into, the hundreds of different, or even not even hundreds, just the 5 or 6 different languages that we often find with coffee, right? Not to mention all the other languages. And, I having lived in China for 10 years, I do speak Mandarin, and it's really interesting how even as you begin to translate words into different languages and from different contexts, it's very challenging. And it's not just kind of like what's the direct translation, but actually it's understanding the culture and how it's used. So absolutely, there's definitely some of those understandings that we have to have in terms of our translations. My point in sharing these here is just to give you a sense. I'm not trying to confuse you. Please, I know that some of this might be confusing, but really the goal is that we see the complexities of even how the coffee industry affects and impacts and influences these definitions. Yeah, on it. I mean, coming from 2013. And what's interesting is under each of these different types of definitions, if you think about what's happening in the global coffee industry, right? So if you think about Uckers back in 1922, we're talking more a very kind of a time period where we're seeing the progression from more kind of lower quality, mass produced, natural, very low quality, pick it and dry it, type of strategies, to where we're seeing washed processing becoming such an important part in washing stations. And so you can kind of understand that each of these terminologies and each of these discussions are rooted in the context that they come from. And so it's definitely an interesting discussion. There's a few more that I want to say. Does Ucker's definition hint at early use of fermentation practices in coffee processing? I believe it does, Tristan. It's a great question. I think what it points to is that there was a very clear understanding that there was microbial activity that was involved. And you can even see some research that talks about using enzymes to speed up or to facilitate faster breakdown of the mucilage. But what I think it does is it definitely does point to the fact that the clear early understanding of fermentation, that while yes, it could impact flavor, it was mainly in a negative sense. So whereas most people were seeing fermentation as, for lack of a better term, a necessary evil, if you allow me to say that, to where we're seeing fermentation as facilitating the hydrolysis or the loosening of that mucilage to be wash free, but it's also what is, if it's done improperly, is causing defects in coffee. And you see that throughout this kind of trend of watch processing that continues on into the late 1900s and even the early 2000s. That was really how people viewed fermentation. And when Pinolense in the early 1990s introduces the mucilage remover, the mechanical mucilage remover, you can see how when you come to that place with this understanding that fermentation is this kind of necessary evil, well, if there's a way we can do it mechanically that's more efficient and more consistent, it's a win-win, right? Because we're not opening ourselves up to those types of conditions. So absolutely. The Brando quote here in 2009, I find is a really interesting one. And he says here that it should be noted that the term fermentation is not appropriate in the case of coffee because unlike cacao, no biochemical reaction takes place inside the coffee bean. It would be more correct to refer to mucilage removal by means of a biochemical reaction or hydrolysis of the mucilage, which covers the parchment beans. This reaction is caused by enzymes, both pectinase and pectase, which are naturally present in coffee cherries. And I enjoy Brando's description here of this. There are some nuances of this that we in recent research are understanding might not be completely accurate. But if we look at, and what Brando is talking about here is specifically this fermentation that's occurring outside in the mucilage of the coffee seed. And I want to mention here in a minute that actually we need to consider as well the activity that's happening inside the seed. And I don't, if I had like a background music, like I do like the dun 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 kind of like, cool, like anyways, like in the movie where you're like anticipating what's next. I should work on that. I should have like background music for different things. That should be fun. Anyways, then finally we get to Schwann and Fleet. This is a 2015, and this is a really, really great textbook. It talks about all kinds of different fermentation aspects, but Schwann and Fleet basically articulate that the fermentations of cacao and coffee are rather complex microbiological processes involving the activity of a wide range of microorganisms, such as yeast, lactic acid bacteria, acetic acid bacteria, spore-forming bacteria, and molds. So Schwann and Fleet take this very microbiology approach to fermentation and articulating the activity that's occurring by microorganisms. Their book Cacao and Coffee Fermentation is a really great book if you're interested in kind of diving more into the specific from a very strict microbiological level. So, are we confused? I don't know about you, but the thing, the point of all of these different definitions wasn't just to overly confuse you or try to complicate things. I think even in our brief kind of descriptions that we presented earlier, or the definitions, you can see that when we even talk about what is fermentation, the opportunity to confuse that with different types of microbiological processes, with different types of outcomes, can begin to be quite complex. And it's why I think over the course of the last 10 years, as the innovations in processing and imagination and creativities of producers has really run wild, we've seen this huge kind of maybe misunderstanding or even a misrepresentation of these concepts, not because people I think are intentionally trying to mislead or because they somehow don't understand. I really honestly believe it's because people are speaking from their experience and what's happening, which is valid. Doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be that way. And that's why we want to provide a greater framework and a greater foundation for how we approach our understanding to fermentation, so that we can take these experiences and different types of outcomes people have had and bring that together with that foundational understanding to really expand and reinforce kind of the pathway forward. Yes, I would be happy to share the names of the textbooks later on. I will, and I can even in an email, because I'll be basically sending everybody an email at the end, kind of in the afternoon, about basically after our class, I'll send you the link for the next session. And in that, I'll just drop a couple links with kind of the names of the sources and things like that we talked through in the previous class. So yes, no problem at all. I'd be happy to do that. So if we're confused, I think that would be completely understandable. When we begin to look at what is fermentation, okay, what specifically is fermentation? The first thing that I want to focus our attention to is we want to look at thinking of fermentation as the conversion of food or mass or compounds into energy, leaving behind byproducts, okay? And we're going to start from a rather kind of foundational understanding, and we'll build on that in terms of adding some kind of terminology and concepts to it. Is there any studies about the fermentation that takes place inside the beans? Yes, there is, and we'll be talking, and I'll share some of that information with you for sure. So great question, Brian. We will definitely get there. So we want to think about fermentation as the conversion of food, so the conversion of byproducts of compounds or food into energy, leaving behind byproducts. And a bit more specifically, we can narrow our definition down to the eating or consuming or breaking down of food, basically this eating being the process of metabolism by microorganisms. So essentially, we're talking about the metabolism of compounds by microorganisms and creating byproducts. Okay, so let's focus in and talk a little bit about this term metabolism, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that today, and I'll share with you a couple of the different metabolic processes in coffee that are significant. So metabolism is a word that basically comes from the Greek that just means to change, okay? So the key part that we're focusing here is that it's all about something is changing. And there's different pathways to that, there's different understandings of that, but as a foundational concept, that's what we're talking about. Cells are constantly carrying out thousands of different chemical reactions. And these are all about keeping the cell alive and healthy. I always remind people that, coffee's main objective in life, as it kind of sits down and thinks about its life's plans, just kidding. But as it thinks about and as it desires that, its main plan is to sustain life. Okay. The goal of a coffee seed is not to give you a delicious cup of morning, afternoon, midday, evening, whatever it is, coffee. Though that's a very nice byproduct of that, that's not its key objection, key objective. It's about sustaining life. And so all of the aspects from how the coffee seed grows to the types of compounds that are present, all of it is functioned around and built around this idea of sustaining life and being healthy. And we need to remember that as we consider the different characteristics and different aspects, what makes high quality coffee. All chemical reactions that take place inside of that cell are collectively referred to as the cell's metabolism. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, if you look at this picture here, you can see this is essentially a diagram of different types of metabolic pathways. Okay, and what we mean by that is it's different processes that are in different chemical reactions and processes inside of a cell that are all about sustaining life and producing the compounds that are essential for survival. In this picture, basically the lines indicate metabolic pathways, and the circles are different compounds that are produced. And so you can see some, like the circle that's down kind of in the middle section here in this area. I'm realizing my mouse isn't coming up now and I'm pointing to something. Sorry about that. But you can see that it's circular, that there's this kind of a circular process where byproducts are being produced and utilized to create other byproducts that then become utilized, and the circle goes on. You can see others which are linear, that one event or one compound creates a situation that then produces a next, that produces the next, and that produces the next. I'm speaking about this in a very foundational. I mean, the complexity of this is just unreal, and it's so fascinating when you begin to, like, I get why people that maybe are like germophobic. I get where that comes from, right? Because if you begin to like really break down and think about at one point all of the different bacteria and yeast that are present and what they're doing and how they even are a part of our systems to sustain life, it's incredible. And it's quite complex. And even when we talk about it in coffee, we like to oftentimes talk about it as